All right, 9 o'clock. Good morning and welcome to CalRecycle's SB 619 Notification of Intent to Comply Form webinar. My name is Alan Osorio and I am part of the SB 619 team. Before we get started, our director, Rachel Maki-Wagner, would like to provide some high-level remarks. Director?
Thank you so much, Alan, and thank you all for participating today. It is so wonderful to be here with all of you and really kicking off what is to be the fastest and most important change to our trash since we started recycling in the 1980s. As all of you know, in 6 weeks, 1383 takes full effect here in California, and we need to work together to make sure that this legislation is successfully implemented across our state in each of our local jurisdictions. And this is really an opportunity today to discuss how best to do that for each of you individually. So thank you for your participation. Implementation of SB 1383 is the fastest and easiest way for our state to fight climate change and move quickly to a circular economy. The world is watching us to see if we can do this successfully. Since its passage in 2016, your local jurisdictions have made incredible progress in reaching our ambitious but very, very doable goals of reduction of organic waste. SB 619 by Senator Laird was passed last year by the legislature and signed by the governor to assure our success in implementation of SB 1383 and solidify the partnership between the state and local governments. Together, we will achieve our goal and lead the nation in organic waste reduction. So really just again want to say thank you to all of you for participation today and really solidifying this partnership that we need to have between the state and local governments to successfully achieve our organic waste reduction goals. So have a great webinar. I look forward to hearing all of your comments.
Thank you, Director. Before we go over logistics today, including the live Q&A, I want to introduce you to those who will be presenting and/or will be available for questions after the presentation portion. At this point, I'd like to ask CalRecycle staff participating in today's webinar to turn their cameras on. Thank you, CalRecycle. CalRecycle, please wave when I call your name. We have Kara Morgan, the branch chief with Local Assistance and Market Development. Ashley Yee, the branch chief with Enforcement. And Carla Miller with the SB 619 team. Also today, we have Jocelyn, Ray, and Julia, who will be assisting with the Q&A portion. As a note, today's webinar is being recorded and will be posted on the CalRecycle website once it has been made ADA accessible. Now, I will briefly turn it over to Jocelyn, who will go over the logistics for the Q&A. CalRecycle team, you may turn off your cameras until the Q&A portion at the end.
Thank you, Alan. Good morning, everyone. I will be going over the instructions for the Q&A session, which will follow the presentation. If you are watching the webinar via the CalEPA broadcast, you may email your questions to the NOIC inbox. If you are using the GoToWebinar platform, please type your question into the question pane. Staff will unmute participants in the order that questions come in so that you may read your question out loud. Note that you will need to unmute yourself on your end in the GoToWebinar when asked to by CalRecycle staff. Please state your affiliation before asking your question. For those watching via the broadcast, we will verbalize some of these questions and responses in the GoToWebinar platform for you to hear as well. CalRecycle staff may respond to some questions in writing through GoToWebinar, so please review the question pane for those responses. Questions and comments regarding the merit of the regulations were responded to during the rulemaking period, so today we will focus on questions or clarifications regarding the notification of intent to comply. Back to you, Alan.
Thank you, Jocelyn. Again, my name is Alan Osorio, and today both Carl and I will be presenting on CalRecycle's development of the SB 1383 Notification of Intent to Comply form. As background, jurisdictions are required to implement the SB 1383 regulations starting January 1st, 2022. As jurisdictions are preparing to implement the regulations, many local governments are facing challenges in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. In response, Governor Newsom signed SB 619, Laird Chapter 508 Statutes of 2021, into law to support local governments as they design and implement successful organic waste recycling programs throughout the state. The law authorizes CalRecycle to waive civil penalties if a jurisdiction submits a notification of intent to comply for some or all of the regulatory requirements and implements the planned actions and timelines. Upon approval by CalRecycle of a jurisdiction's notification and implementation by the jurisdiction, a jurisdiction may be eligible for both of the following. 1. Administrative civil penalty relief for the 2022 calendar year pursuant to Public Resources Code Section 42652.5D, and 2. A corrective action plan pursuant to Title 14 California Code of Regulations Section 18996.2. CalRecycle may address through a corrective action plan any violations disclosed in a jurisdiction's notification that will take more than 180 days to correct. In this situation, the proposed actions and schedule in the jurisdiction's approved notification will be in effect until a corrective action plan is issued. Notification requirements. A jurisdiction shall, at minimum, include the following in its notification. 1. A description with specificity of the continuing violations. 2. A detailed explanation of the reasons, supported by documentation, why the jurisdiction is unable to comply. 3. A description of the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic on compliance. And 4. A description of the proposed actions the jurisdiction will take to remedy the violations within the timelines established in Title 14 California Code of Regulations, Section 18996.2, with a proposed schedule for doing so. The proposed action shall be tailored to remedy the violations in a timely manner. Jurisdictions are to adopt a resolution by its respective governing body affirming the contents and timeline of its notification of intent to comply. As stated in the previous slide regarding administrative civil penalty relief, for violations of the regulations that are disclosed in the notification and approved by CalRecycle, CalRecycle will waive administrative civil penalties, and penalties will not accrue for the outlined violations in the notification during the 2022 calendar year if the jurisdiction implements the proposed actions according to the schedule proposed in the notification. The notification and a resolution adopted by the governing body of the jurisdiction shall be sent to CalRecycle no later than Tuesday, March 1st, 2022. Notifications and the resolutions should be emailed to the Notification of Intent to Comply inbox, noic@calrecycle.ca.gov. Although we will not be reviewing any notifications until January 1st, 2022, CalRecycle will accept notifications with resolutions beginning Wednesday, December 1st, 2021. CalRecycle will respond in writing to a jurisdiction's notification submission within 45 business days of receiving the notification with one of the following: an approval, a disapproval, a request for additional information, or a timeline for a decision on approval or disapproval. If CalRecycle disapproves the notification due to the notification not meeting the requirements, CalRecycle will include in the response a justification for the disapproval. I will now hand it over to Carla for a live demonstration of the Notification of Intent to Comply form.
Thank you, Alan, and good morning, everyone. As Alan mentioned, CalRecycle has developed and is providing a notification form as a convenience to assist jurisdictions for purposes of submitting a notification of intent to comply to CalRecycle, as described in Public Resources Code section 42652.5C. I want to point out that use of this form is optional and not a regulatory requirement. I'm going to start by demonstrating where to find information about the notification on our website. So starting from the CalRecycle homepage, you will scroll down to the update section. And find new 1383 resources. You will click on the Learn More button, and this will take you to the short-lived climate pollutant reduction strategy webpage. Next, you will scroll to the enforcement section and click on the Learn More button. This will take you to the enforcement web pages where you will find the SB 619 Notification of Intent to Comply section. And then click on the Learn More button. Here you will find information about the Notification of Intent to Comply, including the process and application form. Once today's presentation and webinar recording have been made ADA compliant, they will be posted here. We also plan to post a list of jurisdictions with approved notifications on this page. So to access this form, click on the Application Form button. And this is what the form looks like. The first page of this form summarizes all of the same information Alan covered in previous slides. The fillable portion of the form begins with administrative information. So we would just ask you to complete all of the information from the jurisdiction name down to the phone number. The real fun begins with section 1. We provided some checkboxes for ease of identifying some of the most common violations. However, it's not all inclusive. So I'm going to scroll down so you can see the list. So from this list, you may select violations using the checkboxes, or you can write in the violations for each applicable regulatory section. For each regulatory section selected or written, you will describe the specific violations related to that regulatory section. We have provided an example to give you an idea of what we are expecting in the way of identifying and describing the violations. So we selected B, 14 CCR section 18984.1, the 3 container organic waste collection services. And we included a description of the violation, not implementing mandatory residential food waste collection for all residents, and not implementing mandatory commercial organics collection for all businesses under 2 cubic yards. Question number 2 and 3 are self-explanatory. And for number 2, we ask that you provide a detailed explanation of the reasons why the jurisdiction is unable to comply, supported by documentation if applicable. And for number 3, we ask for a description of the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic on compliance. For section 4, we ask that you provide a description of the proposed actions the jurisdiction will take to remedy the violations, with a proposed schedule for completing each action. We have provided an optional format in this document, so let's take a look at that. In this section, we are looking for tasks associated with remedying the violations to achieve compliance. We have provided examples to give an idea of what we are expecting in the way of identifying tasks. So using the example from section 1, where we identified section 18984.1, the 3-container organic waste collection services. We included the description again, not implementing mandatory residential food waste collection for all residents. And then we identified what tasks may be needed in order to provide mandatory residential food waste collection. We identified purchasing 2 additional collection trucks and modifying collection routes. And the proposed date to be completed is April 7th, 2022. The second task we identified is the city working with its hauler to find a facility to accept mixed organic waste, with the date to be completed of April 14th, 2022. Because we identified 2 violations for that section, we added in this example the second violation, which included not implementing mandatory commercial organics collection for all businesses under 2 cubic yards. And we identified tasks for that violation of purchasing 2 additional collection trucks and modifying collection routes, with the proposed date to be completed of April 21, 2022. And the second task, the city will work with its hauler to acquire and distribute appropriate containers to all commercial accounts, and will obtain monthly reports from the hauler to monitor full distribution of carts, with the completion date of April 28, 2022. So lastly, you will need to sign the form and send it along with the resolution adopted by your governing body to the notification of intent to comply inbox, noic@calrecycle.ca.gov. So that concludes the overview of CalRecycle's notification of intent to comply form. For more information, we encourage you to subscribe to the SLCP listserv, visit the SLCP homepage on the CalRecycle website, contact your local assistance and market development liaison, or email the notification of intent to comply inbox listed here. Lastly, I want to note that this presentation is a guidance tool developed for information and example purposes only. The disclaimer specifies use of this document is optional. It is not an enforceable regulatory requirement and does not ensure regulatory compliance if it is used. I will now hand it to Jocelyn to begin the Q&A portion.
Thanks, Carla. So here's a reminder of how the Q&A session will go. If you are watching the webinar via the CaliPA broadcast, you may email your questions to the NOIC inbox. If you are using the GoToWebinar platform, please type your question into the question pane. Staff will unmute participants in the order that questions come in. Note that you will need to unmute yourself on your end when asked to by CalRecycle staff. Please state your name and affiliation before asking your question. Questions and comments regarding the merit of the regulations were responded to during the rulemaking period. So today we will focus on questions or clarifications regarding the notification of intent to comply. So I will now start us off with the first question. The first question is coming from Elena Lip, and I'm sorry if I mispronounced her name, but you are unmuted. Please unmute yourself and state your affiliation and ask your question.
Hi, yeah, my name is Lena Lip. You said it right. I'm affiliated with the city of Sausalito. We have prepared a waiver because we have a very low population. And I just wanted to know if the waiver and the notice of intent should be filed together, and how will they be considered if we're submitting both?
Yeah, that's a good question, and thanks for the question. I know Kara could probably respond a little bit better. She's a little bit more privy to the waiver forms there. So Kara, do you want to take that one?
Sure, happy to. Hey, thank you for your question. So you should submit them separately. But I think what's important for you to consider is, first of all, the low population waiver allows you to be waived from implementing certain requirements in the regulation, primarily as it relates to the organic waste collection requirements for a period of 5 years. The SB 619 notification process is where you are identifying that you have a regulatory gap that you're not waived from and that you need additional time. And so by submitting the notification, you're identifying what that regulatory gap is and what your planned activities and timeline for addressing that gap. So, you know, we'd be happy to set up a follow-up meeting with you for your particular situation so we could walk through what might be, you know, like the best approach, whether you should maybe consider submitting a notification or not. Does that help?
Yes, it does. Thank you so much. And I would appreciate any guidance you could give.
Okay, perfect. If you don't mind, if we don't have it, just put your contact information in the Q&A and we'll get a meeting set up with you ASAP.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you both for that. Our next question is from Jeannie O'Loughlin. Jeannie, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you on our end. Please unmute yourself, state your name, affiliation, and ask your question.
Thank you. I'm Jeannie O'Loughlin. I'm the mayor of California City. So I was a little confused when you were talking about the resolution. We did our resolution at our last meeting, but I know that, you know, we're right around the corner from 2022. So is this what you just went through? Is this what we need to do to say, yeah, we're going to be a little late and these are the things that we're going to be doing? So I was a little confused on what you want us to submit besides the resolution for the beginning.
Yeah, I could take a stab at that, and then Kara or Carla could chime in there. So I do want to just remind everybody that this is an optional form that you can use to submit your 619 notification of intent to comply. It is, you don't have to use this form. A jurisdiction can use another template or that they create to meet the requirements of 619. So as what we've presented today, CalRecycle has developed this form template that covers the requirements of 619, and that's required to be within there. As Carla went over and outlined, there are those 4 requirements that we've included within the form. And then on top of that, there is the resolution that needs to be adopted by the governing body that needs to be tied with that and submitted to CalRecycle. So does that, and Kara, did you want to chime in on anything that I might have missed?
Yeah, hey, Jeannie, if I understand your question, you might need to give us some clarity. The ordinance that you're talking about is your 1383 Enforcement Ordinance. Is that correct?
I believe so, yes.
Yeah, that's my guess. So it's really, we're talking about 2 separate things. So your 1383 Enforcement Ordinance is a requirement. Every jurisdiction must have an enforceable ordinance or mechanism, which sounds like your city is on track for that. This process is for jurisdictions that they know that they need more time to comply with the regulations. So for example, we have some jurisdictions that are not going to be able to implement, say, their residential food waste collection program until 2023, okay? That's a situation where a jurisdiction would utilize this process so that they can be protected from penalties if they are implementing their proposed schedule. So in that scenario, the jurisdiction would submit a SB 619 request with their adopted resolution, and they would outline how they are going to comply by implementing that residential food waste program and what the associated timeline is with those activities. So I don't know, Jeannie, if your situation for your jurisdiction that you're going to have any gaps with implementing the regulations. So if you'd like, we'd be happy to set up a follow-up meeting with your staff to talk about your particular situation, or you may already know. So if you've already got your commercial and residential program ready to start, or it's already started, if your team is working on implementing the edible food program, if your team is working on implementing its procurement program, your team's getting its record keeping going, this process may not be needed for your jurisdiction. Does that help, Jeannie?
That's very helpful. Thank you very much.
You bet.
Thank you for your question, and thank you, Kara, for responding. So our next question is coming from Oscar Ortiz. His question is, do you have a sample of a resolution? Kara, I know you answered that question, which was just a no. If you had anything else to add to that, or we just move on to the next question.
Thanks for the question, Oscar. I'll chime in a little bit. So unfortunately, the department does not have resolution templates for jurisdictions. The department leaves that up to on the jurisdiction side to have those on their end for the development. So the department doesn't get into the local aspects of development of any resolutions on the local side. Kara, did you want to add anything to that? Adding additional context?
Yeah, the only context I would add is we felt that with what is in the statute, that would be the basis of what you would put into your resolution. So, I think we'd be happy to provide that language. We can put that later in the Q&A, but it's pretty straightforward, basically stating that, our jurisdiction is not able to comply, and therefore we are submitting this request, notification request. So pretty straightforward resolution. The purpose of it is to ensure that the request, the request to CalRecycle has been approved by your, either City Council or Board of Supervisors. So let us know if that helps answer the question or not. Thanks so much.
Sounds like that answered the question. Next question is from Suzanne Logatoff. They ask, am I understanding that if a business is not going to be in 100% compliance by January 1st, 2022, we must complete the NOIC and submit a resolution with the NOIC? Answer to this was, this is for all jurisdictions.
And I'll add additional clarity. Suzanne, thank you for the question. So I'm kind of interpreting the question one way, but it's kind of not fully clear. But what I'm reading there also is that you're asking if it's a business is not going to be 100% compliance. So we're not, the intent and the purpose of SB 619 and the NOIC is for jurisdictions to implement the regulations, having a program in place. And as you see on the forum that Carla went out, there was some examples, although not all inclusive, but implementation of the regulations, the collection system, having an edible food program, so on and so forth. Not so much if one particular business is non-compliant. I think that could be handled, but is there a program to set up and offer collection for that particular business? So hopefully that provides additional clarity on things, Suzanne. If not, feel free to chime in or add another question in there if I was totally off base or if we were totally off base in answering your question.
And Suzanne, we are unmuting you on our end if you'd like to add some more clarification.
No, thank you very much. That answered my question.
Great.
Okay, so our next question is coming from Colleen Foster. Colleen, I've unmuted you on your end, so, oh, sorry, on my end, just unmute yourself on your end and state your affiliation and question.
Thank you. My name is Colleen Foster, Environmental Officer for the City of Oceanside. What I'm struggling with here, and there's been a lot of guidance in several professional industry organizations that have stated the 619 process is overly cumbersome, could potentially put a jurisdiction, kind of in the forefront for enforcement, and potentially the normal NOV process with SB 1383 would be the better way to go. So I'm still struggling on whether, a jurisdiction should do the 619 or go with the NOV through SB 1383. And just to second that, my next question is, SB 1383 has over 600 sections. So for small to medium-sized cities that depend heavily on franchise agreements, if they don't have a franchise agreement in place to do everything, for the most part, they may be almost 100% in non-compliance. So are they expected to write a justification for each and every one of those 600 sections?
Yeah, I could take the first crack at answering your question, Colleen. So how I've interpreted your question, you do talking about the NOV process. So there's an NOV process associated on both sides. So there's an NOV process from the department upon the jurisdiction and providing an NOV on that aspect. And there's also a jurisdiction to particular businesses or customers within the actual jurisdiction for going the NOV process. How I'm interpreting, and I could be wrong, the NOV process of 1383 is the department issuing NOVs to jurisdictions. Is that, or are you referring to jurisdictions upon businesses? So just a little clarifying outliner there.
I'm only speaking to enforcement against jurisdiction.
Okay.
So I'm working on this question with my attorneys, and we're really struggling with what is the best path to go forward with, especially considering we don't have staffing or expertise to even do this process.
Yeah. So Colleen, thank you for clarifying. As was stated earlier in the presentation, this form is, it is optional for jurisdictions to submit a NOIC. So they don't have to. If they wanted to go and choose to go the route and not submit a form, then they could go through the normal process. The 619 really provides the administrative penalty relief for 2022. That is something that was really built in and provided that additional for the jurisdiction. Kara, did you want to chime in? Did you want to have any? Did you have any thoughts additional to Colleen's question?
Hey, thanks, Alan. Colleen, thank you for your question. I think what you are kind of grappling with is which is the best route to go. And I think to Alan's point, it's hard for us to provide that advice. Absolutely, SB 619 provides relief from penalties for the year 2022 if the jurisdiction is implementing its proposed actions and meeting those timelines. So that's really the main difference between both processes. With that said, with our enforcement process, if a jurisdiction through the normal process is placed on an NOV or corrective action plan, they do have the opportunity to get that gap corrected during that time. And, we intend to use penalties as a tool if it's necessary. However, if that jurisdiction does address the gaps while it's in that enforcement process, then, we're intending to use penalties as an additional tool. So I hope that it doesn't help answer your question or make the decision, because ultimately it's a decision for the city to make.
Mm-hmm.
I apologize. Can I ask a follow up to that? I apologize. It's around the same thinking.
Sure.
If a jurisdiction goes in and applies for 619, knowing they're not going to come into compliance almost entirely within 2022, like they're looking at coming into compliance in 2023. If that's the case, if they filed for 619, they don't come into compliance for 2022, could they be retroactively penalized for the full year?
Yeah, so it depends. So first and foremost, the scenario you're presenting, the jurisdiction has a gap that takes them into 2023. The SB 619 process would allow for penalties for 2023. So what it relieves a jurisdiction from are penalties from 2022. Why I said it depends is if any time a jurisdiction is found not to be implementing its proposed schedule and actions, then the statute does allow CalRecycle to go all the way back to 2022 if penalties are going to be accrued. So it is going to depend on what happens with that jurisdiction and their implementation.
Mm-hmm.
So the jurisdiction couldn't do nothing in 2022.
They absolutely cannot. And we'll be monitoring. We haven't set the frequency yet, but at least probably on a quarterly basis. So if we find that a jurisdiction is doing nothing or not meeting what it had submitted in the notification, then we will begin the next steps in the enforcement process. So, that jurisdiction's already in the enforcement process by having an NOV or notice of violation or corrective action plan. So we can immediately then begin the penalty process. And again, as I stated, if the jurisdiction has not implemented its proposed schedule and action, then we have the ability of going back to 2022, and they are not relieved from penalties for 2022. Does that help clarify?
Definitely. So if a jurisdiction was to do nothing, it almost could be better to go through SB 1383 NOV, because you're only going to start that based upon who you feel the highest violators are. So you can kind of almost like hide or back. I don't know how to be forefront, but you can almost, you're trying to do something, but you can't commit to anything in 2022. So you take a risk in doing 619.
I hear that perspective. I think what our team is doing is we are closely monitoring each and every jurisdiction. So we're already going to have our finger on the pulse if a jurisdiction is doing nothing. And certainly that would be a high priority for us. So I don't think it's going to be really hard for anyone to get away with doing nothing. Alan?
Yeah, and as Kara and adding to what Kara stated, it's all really going to depend on the jurisdiction, what their situation is, how far they're along in implementation of 1383. As was presented in today's presentation, the CAP process is associated with 619, so it's the timelines that are associated that will be developed in creation to get the jurisdiction to implement, and that would be something that the department will work with the jurisdiction as part of the CAP process to develop that time and that path moving forward to come into compliance with SB 1383. So hopefully that answers your question, Colleen. If not, feel free to, you could tag up with us offline and we could definitely have a conversation. Next question, Ray and Jocelyn.
Yes, right now we're going to jump to the NOIC inbox. The first question is from Steve Devine from Marin County. Steve asks, is the need to also submit a resolution along with the SB 619 form and statute? The next question to that is, we thought the due date was April 1st, not March 1st. Did this change?
Yeah, so good question. So there is an April 1st deadline that is floating around. That's the initial jurisdiction report, report, which I believe, if I got that correct, that's separate. That's entirely different. That's part of the reporting process of SB 1383. The resolution is required. That is within statute to be submitted with the notification of intent to comply form.
Alan, just to clarify, not resolution, enforceable ordinance or mechanism.
Okay. So
I think that's where folks are getting confused, because we have a resolution for this process and we have a 1383 enforceable ordinance or mechanism. And so I think, and typically when you bring forward an ordinance, there's a resolution by council or the board of supervisors to approve. So I think that's kind of how that happens. Anyways, there's some confusion with terminology.
So hopefully that answers your question. If not, feel free to touch base with us and send in another question if we were off base on that.
Thanks, Alan and Kara. So the next question is also coming from the inbox from Etienne Ozarek. Sorry if I mispronounced your name. From the city of Glendale, their question is, since SB 1383 goes into effect in January 2022 and hence not currently into effect, what is considered a violation at this point, 2021, or a continued violation as defined in 619?
So since the regulations don't go into effect until January 1, 2022, anything that's occurring now is not actually in effect. What we're doing and Kara's team is doing is prepping up the jurisdictions for success in implementation and getting things together for Jan 1, 2022. But there are technically no violations for SB 1383 today because the regulations don't go into effect until Jan 1, 2022.
Okay, if there's nothing else to add from that, the next question in keeping with the inbox is from Tracy Gillard with the city of Elk Grove. They ask, does SB 619 or does the SB 619 form replace the need to complete and submit a formal letter of intent to comply?
Can you state that question again? I got the last part.
Sure.
Sorry,
Sure. Again, does the SB 619 form replace the need to complete and submit a formal letter of intent to comply?
Yeah. And hello, Tracy from the city of Elk Grove. Nice to hear from you. So SB 619 and the requirement of that is to submit a notification of intent to comply. So that's kind of your general outlier of what 619 is. The form that was presented today is an optional template that jurisdictions can utilize to identify all of their continuing violations with timelines that are associated. So filling out the templated form with the violations of the 4 requirements, in addition to a jurisdiction's resolution, would fulfill, if complete, would fulfill a jurisdiction's notification of intent to comply requirement. So hopefully that answers the question. I know that we're throwing out a lot of terms here, form, notification, resolution, ordinances. But if that doesn't answer your question, Tracy, feel free to touch base with us offline, and we could surely clear things up for you.
Thanks, Alan. So our next question is also from the inbox, coming from Sadie Caldas, Placer County. Their question is, do all proposed timelines need to be within the 2022 calendar year? Because penalties may begin in 2023. Does CalRecycle have the option of approving a NOI with that has a proposed schedule with compliance for some tasks after 2022?
Yeah, and that's a great question. So what the department, what we're looking for is we want the jurisdictions to fill out and identify their continuing violations along with realistic timeframes for a jurisdiction to actually implement and address those violations. There may be some violations that are on there that may not be completed within 2022. Obviously, if we get something and it says we'll complete that by 2028, there'll probably be some follow-up from the department to ask additional questions. Kara, do you want to chime in on anything, or Ashley maybe on any additional clarity on what we're kind of looking at for the notification and some of the schedules and timelines? I would really just note that to see realistic timeframes that address, and specifically state within the language there, that address them in a timely manner. That's really what it says in statute. But Kara or Ashley, do you want to chime in on anything else?
Yeah, I'll start, and then let us know if there's more clarity that you would like. So as Alan noted, the statute requires that any gaps in the regulatory requirement are addressed in a timely manner. That is tied directly to the timeline laid out in the regulations. So if a jurisdiction has a regulatory gap and they need 6 months or less to correct it, then that is what we call issuing a notice of violation. If a jurisdiction needs an additional year and a half or an additional 2.5 years because the last one is due to infrastructure, then they may be placed on a corrective action plan. Outside of those timelines, CalRecycle does have discretion to consider additional time. We would really be assessing, to Alan's point, the need and what are the circumstances that require more time. Recognizing particularly maybe infrastructure, there could be very valid reasons that time beyond what's laid out in the corrective action plan process is necessary. So we would ask that you build your timeline as establishing the schedule that's as timely as possible. And then to let us know in your request, if additional time is needed, what that is for, what's needed. We will likely, we don't plan to go beyond the timeline that's laid out in the corrective action plan initially, but we may revisit that and are able to modify the corrective action plan as is allowed in statute.
Mm-hmm. Adding to that, Kara, within statute, there is the 180 days that CalRecycle may go into a corrective action plan, which Kara was stating, with timelines associated within the corrective action plan as well. So.
Thank you. The next question is from Susan Contreras. Susan asks, the second violation example stated non-compliance for organics to all commercial generating under 2 cubic yards. Is under 2 cubic yards required? In the answer pane, Kara responded, yes, waste generators are covered by the regulation. Anything else you'd like to clarify?
No, so I think, if your city was not preparing to provide collection service to all organic waste generators, whether that's residents or commercial businesses, and, you need additional time that can't be addressed, say in early 2022, then that may be reason for you to submit an SB 619 notification. We would be happy to set up a follow-up meeting with you to discuss your particular situation if you have follow-up questions. Thanks.
Thanks, Kara. So our next question is coming from Jessica Reed. Their question was, will a template resolution be provided? And the response is, we currently do not have a template. Kara, Carla, or Alan, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, this question was stated earlier just with the resolution. Any jurisdictions that have, additional questions, we could have a conversation offline. Kara's team is available probably to discuss that. But mainly, as Kara stated within her response, we're really straightforward, and we just want to ensure that the jurisdictions have it outlined and their governing body is aware and is providing that authorization to move forward with addressing.
The next question is from Jessica Reed. Will a template resolution be provided? As we said earlier, we currently do not have a template, unfortunately. Is there anything else you'd like to elaborate on?
No, I think that's good. I think that seems like a popular question today.
Alan just addressed it. So I think we're covered with all of the resolution questions.
Our next question is coming from Chris Schroeder. Their question is, does SB 619 apply to all aspects of procurement under SB 1383 or only the solid waste portion? The response was, it's any aspects in SB 1383, including procurement.
Yeah, and Chris, if that doesn't, if you need additional clarity on that, feel free to touch base with us offline.
Next question is from Diane Friedman. I believe Diane has a couple questions in our pane, so we'll go ahead and open it up to them. Diane, you are now unmuted on our end. If you unmute yourself, please state your name, affiliation, and ask your questions.
Yes, good morning. My name is Diane Friedman. I'm the Deputy Town Manager from the town of Danville, and this question relates to procurement. We have done a lot of due diligence around can we buy biomass electricity? Can we, what can we procure to meet our 3,500 tons per year? And what we're coming up with is mulch and compost and paper right now, because when we look at infrastructure or availability of certified biomass facilities, our electricity providers are not there. So this really goes to the goal. We are intending to comply with the record keeping and procuring. Does the fact that we know that we're not going to meet our goal, does that mean that we have to submit an intent to comply, or we just do what we can and take it from there when we look at what our results are?
Yeah, good question, Diane, and I could take a stab at answering it, and then Kara could follow up, or Carla. So SB 619 is really intended for any jurisdictions that feel that they have continuing violations. They didn't want to identify that and want to ensure that they put that forward because it provides them penalty relief for calendar year 2022. So although we can't directly tell you that you need to, Diane, that you need to apply, but if you feel that you have a continuing violation, in this case, meeting your procurement goal, the option is there for you to submit the notification of intent to comply form, which outlines potentially any procurement not meeting your goals and outlining that, and then a plan for the city of Danville to address and meet their procurement goal.
Okay.
And I think,
yeah, Diane, Ashley and I are also going to chime into Alan's response and provide a little context as well. We recognize procurement and meeting the procurement target is an incredible challenge for jurisdictions. The target itself was set based upon the amount of organic waste that we would have in 2025. So we already acknowledge by setting that target in that way that we have a stretch gap ahead of us. We also recognize that the infrastructure, the market, is not yet at a position to provide enough material. So for example, for some jurisdictions, we're just starting some of the collection services, so that material is not in the marketplace yet. Additionally, we know that there are challenges for some jurisdictions in finding, a variety of approaches to deal with their procurement target. So the way that our enforcement process is set up is that it does provide CalRecycle with enforcement discretion to consider the totality of a jurisdiction's circumstances. So the fact you telling us, we've done all of this planning, assessment, record keeping, so we are doing all that we can. When we conduct a compliance evaluation, we would be looking at all of those factors to determine whether an enforcement action is necessary or not. So I'd like to turn it to Ashley.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks, Kara and Alan. So great question, Diane. And these are conversations that Kara and her team are having with the jurisdictions that reach out to her. So I would encourage you to reach out to Kara and her assistance team so they can help strategize with you on some different options for procurement. Maybe it could be a regional approach, utilizing state agencies, etc. So just like Kara said, we do recognize that the procurement goals are really hefty right now, and they were just released for everyone who didn't catch that yesterday. So happy to chat with you. Again, feel free to reach out Kara or your local assistance and market development contact for strategies on how to get there.
Thank you.
So I'm looking at the time. It is 9:52. We're going to get to as many questions as we can before the webinar ends at 10. But just as a reminder, if we don't get to your question, that we will be following up with either you directly through either the questions that come in through the inbox or the questions that are coming through the chat. So we'll definitely do our best to get through everybody within a timely manner after the webinar. So feel free to continue to submit your questions. Next question.
Next question from Kanya. All right, go ahead. Kanya, you are unmuted on our end. If you want to go ahead and unmute yourself, state your name, affiliation, and ask your question.
City of Lakewood Environmental Programs Manager. My question kind of echoes Colleen Foster's of Oceanside. What's the benefit of self-reporting versus not? Because basically that's kind of what you're doing is self-reporting. In many cases, a lot of cities have already approved their ordinance or are about to before the end of the year. And, I mirror Colleen's question, of the same thing. We're grappling the same thing. So I think a lot of cities are just kind of afraid to say that. So, really what's the benefit? And then just kind of another question, which was in my thing further down is, it's my understanding that our local assistance folks are all turning into enforcement folks and transitioning into enforcement. And is there any truth to that?
Yeah, I could start it off there, and I'm sure Kara could chime in on that with her branch and the transition there. So Konya, it's great to hear from you again. It's been a while since we talked way back when. But in regards to jurisdictions and submission of a notification, one thing that jurisdictions could look at when they're submitting these forms is that they're getting a response back from the department of either the approval. So there's that documentation process in writing that the department provides the jurisdiction that really provides that administrative penalty relief for 2022 for the calendar year. And everything is outlined within there. Through that process, the jurisdiction is really outlining their schedule, and should any actions be further past the 180 days, there is that process that the department could explore there and look at and putting together a corrective action plan and working the department to come up with timeframes to get on track of implementation of the regulations. So I'll add that and provide that. But again, as we stated earlier, every jurisdiction It's really going to be a case by case, what makes the best sense for that jurisdiction, what their situation is in that regard. So with that, I'll turn it over to Kara. She'll probably want to add in on some of the part 2 questions or a little bit of part 1 that I may have not covered.
Yeah. Hey, Konya, thank you for your question. So much really depends on your jurisdiction's particular circumstances with program implementation. Some jurisdictions are close. Once they get their ordinance passed, they're rolling out mandatory collection services in early 2022. That may be a situation where the city feels that it's really not necessary to submit a notification, because by the time CalRecycle conducts the compliance evaluation, the jurisdiction would have addressed the gap, have its programs in place. So, I think every jurisdiction situation is unique, and what we've been doing is having conversations with jurisdictions about their particular circumstance, and happy to have that conversation. We are in the process of forming the new enforcement branch. Part of the local assistance and market development team, as well as the existing jurisdiction compliance unit team, will be staffing that branch. Both branches will have almost an equal number of staff and units, supervisors, managers. Actually, it's virtually identical. So we are setting up a structure like that. With that said, the two branches will be working very closely together, very collaboratively, as we have a situation on the assistance side where we have an enforcement need. Our team would be working closely with the enforcement staff to deal with it. Same thing with the enforcement staff. They really find a jurisdiction has a need for compliance assistance, then we'd have our assistance team dealing with that. As we roll out the new branches, we will be communicating to jurisdictions. We will be letting jurisdictions know if there's a change to their local assistance liaison. We'll make those introductions and get those relationships set up. Ashley?
And then I just wanted to emphasize, we are getting a lot of questions, Konya, like yours and Oceanside, about the NOV process versus the NOINC process. There's one really big difference between those two, and that is some jurisdictions through our regular NOV process may not qualify for a corrective action plan. So 619 does fast track you onto this corrective action plan as long as you fill out everything required in 619. So as a reminder for that NOV process within 1383, jurisdictions need to provide that you guys cannot do something because of extraneous circumstances, and that you need to be providing sufficient funding and adequate staff to ensure compliance. So that is something to consider when you're thinking about submitting 619 versus trying to go the NOV route through regular 1383. So again, that's just a fast track onto a cap for 619 if you choose that route. So I just wanted to make that clarification that not all jurisdictions may be able to provide that substantial effort that SB 6 or 1383 has in it right now.
Ashley, would you mind terribly if I pipe in there a little bit? Sorry to jump into the conversation here, but I think it's important to revisit the intent of the original legislation and the intent of SB 619 and really what that speaks to. As we all know, SB 1383 it was passed in 2016 with some pretty significant goals, but those goals are really requirements on the local jurisdictions, and it's really incumbent upon the local jurisdictions to meet the requirements of the organics reductions. SB 619 was really meant to provide an additional tool to local jurisdictions to work with the state on finding a path. So as I'm hearing a lot of the questions and comments and concerns today, what I'm hearing is a desire to get on that path with the state, and 619 is a tool to do that. And that is really what the intention was when the legislature passed that. So if it is not the right tool for your jurisdiction, then that, there is another direction to go. But I imagine that it will be an important tool for a lot of jurisdictions to show to the legislature and the state and their own constituents that they have charted the path to compliance with the 1383 requirements, and that though that path is very deliberate and thoughtful, and that is then how the jurisdiction is working with the state to get there.
Thank you, Director Wagner. So with that, I think we could end on that, right on the dot, 10 o'clock. I want to thank everyone for participating and joining us in today's webinar. As a note and a reminder, today's webinar was recorded and will be posted on the CalRecycle website once it goes through the 88 process. All questions that were submitted either through the email inbox or through the questions pane, somebody from CalRecycle will be following up with you to ensure that your answers and your questions are answered in a timely manner. So with that, everybody have a good rest of the day, and we will talk to you guys soon.